Hi, everyone. This is Anne-Marie Gaddy from Classic Movie Hub. I am so happy to be hosting the third event in the Screen Classics discussion series from Classic Movie Hub, University Press of Kentucky, and co-host Citizen Screen. Tonight's event is Vitagraph, America's first great motion picture studio. And I have a feeling we're going to learn a lot of interesting facts tonight, and I'm really excited about that. That said, our guests for the evening are authors Andrew Erish and Robert Crane. And I'm here once again with my friend and fabulous film fan, Aurora from Citizen Screen. And Aurora will tell us just a little bit more about tonight's event.
Well, thank you, Anne-Marie. I'm thrilled to be here. I'll tell you a little bit about our special guest tonight. Andrew Erish is the author of Colonel William N. Seelig, The Man Who Invented Hollywood, and of course, the book we're featuring tonight, Vitagraph, America's first great motion picture studio, which, by the way, I just finished, and it is fantastic. The story flows, it is meticulously researched. Just every classic movie fan, anybody interested in the history of motion pictures has to read this. Here to discuss the book with Andrew is Robert Crane. Robert is the son of actor Bob Crane and the author of several books, including My Life as a Mankiewicz, Jack Nicholson, The Early Years, Bruce Dern, a memoir, and Crane, Sex, Celebrity, and My Father's Unresolved Murder. So this is going to be great tonight, Anne-Marie.
Terrific. And before we get started, I do just want to mention that we will be taking questions tonight because obviously it's a live chat. So just please feel free to type in any comments you have below. And well, I guess we're ready to roll. So now please join me in welcoming Andrew Erish and Robert Crane.
Thank you very much, both of you, for the introductions. I'm going to take it first just to show you a previous book that you folks talked about, Colonel Seelig, The Man Who Invented Hollywood by Andrew Erish. And of course, the latest book, there it is, Vitagraph, Andrew Erish, about the first great motion picture studio. Andy, great to have you.
Thank you, sir.
Love the book, as Anne-Marie and Aurora both said, and I third it. Great research, fun read. I hate the word fun, but it was a fun read. I didn't want to put it down, and you just make it easy to go through the material, and there's a lot of material that you packed in there.
There
so
is.
First things first.
Sure.
Share the book again for everybody at home, Colonel Seelig and Vitagraph. Now, these are about, the first major motion picture studios, and it's the end of, it's 1895-ish into the beginning of the next century. So you obviously have an interest in that era. Why?
Yeah. I'm probably the last surviving link to that era. That's the only way I can put it. The last living person that was there. I don't know. I like this stuff. At a certain point in my life, we all grew up loving classic movies, right? You wouldn't be watching this, or I owe you a lot of money. One or the other, you're watching this. And at a certain point, I didn't like the contemporary movies as much as I did the older ones. And I felt like I had seen all the older ones that are readily available. So what haven't I seen?
Right.
And I was reading film history books and stuff, and I was, intrigued. And when I was doing my research on Colonel Seelig, Vitagraph kept coming up, and it was clearly the humongous, great American studio in the first half or more of the American film industry in the silent era. And just not a lot was written about it. And I had way too many questions. And when I finished Seelig, my friend Kevin Brownlow said, "What are you going to write next?" I said, you know, there's not a lot written about Vitagraph. And he goes, you must write it. I said, "Oh, okay." So
Yeah.
I did.
To add to Anne Marie and Aurora's introduction of you, I'd like to add too that you taught film and
Yeah.
film history for many years at Chapman University in Southern California. Was that where you saw some of the Vitagraph and Colonel Seelig films and
No.
to whet your appetite, or?
They're entirely missing. Both companies are missing from all the film history textbooks. They're missing from virtually all of the kind of highbrow film history books. When they're mentioned at all, it's usually in error. And that helped to motivate me too. Someone's got to set the record straight. And, you know, I think a lot of us like to do, when we're interested in something, how did this thing start? Where did it come from? If you love movies, how did that start? And there are so many myths about how movies started that have been published as fact for 100 years now. And
Right.
You do the research into this stuff and you realize it's not like that at all. It's a completely different story. So
And what does Vitagraph mean or stand for, the word?
you know, it's a good question. When these two guys that started the company were starting out, there were 5 motion picture companies, major companies in America in the 1890s that started. They all got up to speed by 1897, early 1898. There was not a word, the words or the term motion pictures didn't exist yet. Moving pictures didn't exist yet.
Right.
So each company tried to come up with a name for whatever this thing was. I mean, talk about starting from scratch. So Albert Smith, who became ultimately the president of Vitagraph, said that they came up with Vitagraph from a Latin term, vita meaning life, graph meaning pictures. So here are life pictures. Here's movement in life as we know it. It's not still photography. This is something brand new. It's going to blow your mind.
Right.
And when they saw movies for the first time, Colonel Seelig had the same feeling. I know that Sigmund Lubin had the same feeling. It's like, I got to do this.
Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
this is amazing.
Yeah. Without giving your whole book Vitagraph away, you mentioned the two gents from England, of all places,
Yeah.
who come to America and ultimately form a film studio. Why didn't they do this in England, and what brought them to America?
You know, they were like so many people that came over in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And to this day, if you're coming to America, you're coming for a better life for most people.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the families were poor and they wanted to see if they could do better in the new world. And J. Stuart Blackton and Albert E. Smith were both kids when they came over. They were both born in 1875.
Wow.
And they both came over in the 80s with their families and just dirt poor. I mean, Blackton, his mom had divorced his dad, I think within weeks after he was born.
Wow.
So he became, as a kid, he was the sole provider for his mom. And Smith's family, both families wound up in New York, didn't know each other when they were in England. Smith's family didn't like New York. There were a couple people in the family that had health issues. So the family moved on to Santa Barbara, California.
Wow.
But Smith, when he's like 12 years old, says, no, I want to stay in New York.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they let him, and they housed him with an elderly couple because he wanted to be a vaudeville entertainer. And he's like, I can't do that in Santa Barbara and expect to have any kind of success.
Yeah.
And Blackton wanted to be a vaudeville entertainer too. They had very different talents and aspirations and stuff. But that's what drew them together.
But okay, so they're both in New York. Why not and they're live entertainers, why
Yeah.
not form a production company that gets into live entertainment a la Broadway? Why film?
Because it's kind of twofold. Smith was a magician, and movies, I mean, had never existed before. You look at that stuff and it's magic. How in the world? It literally blows people away. And they, like I said, combine their talents to do a evening's vaudeville program themselves. So Smith was the magician. He did ventriloquism. He did shadow puppets on the wall, shadow imagery. Blackton was an artist, and he would draw very quickly. He would draw people in the audience. He would draw well-known figures in the press and things like that. And they thought initially these moving pictures, you know, when Thomas Edison never got out of the laboratory trying to scheme how he was going to rip someone else off. He didn't have much of a life outside of that. So he never got to the theater. And in theaters, there were things called magic lantern shows where there were slideshows and projected on a big screen and still images, and those were entertaining. And everyone that followed in that wake, you know, looked into these little individual viewing cabinets that the Edison company was churning out starting in 1894, and like, well, why aren't these projected for big audiences in a big room? So they thought, you know, if we can figure out how to project this stuff, we can supplement our act with movies.
Right.
And I think the first movie they bought was the Edison ripoff of the Lumiere film about the train coming into the train station.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And when the Edison people ran it, they just ran the movie. And that's scary enough. All of a sudden you see a train coming towards you. Blackton and Smith take it a step further. They bought a copy of that film because they didn't have the money to make films yet themselves. And Smith would project it. Blackton stood behind the screen with a train whistle and some large sheet of metal he's banging on, and he's trying to make train noises. And they said that literally the people in the front rows especially were running for their lives or falling back in their seats and screaming and going nuts. And it was a blast. They were like, yeah, we're onto something here.
Yeah. What stage was camera and film technology?
You know, in the beginning, because Edison is running the patents, and the book gets into all this, the patent wars and stuff like that. But if you're guys like Smith and Blackton or Colonel Seelig, you're poor. You can't draw funds from anything else. It took these guys over a year to save up for a projector. And then it took a while longer making some money on the road doing one-nighters, vaudeville shows, to figure out how to build a camera and then make improvements on the projector and things like that. So they were finally shooting their own stuff by the end of 1897, beginning of 1898. And it's, you know, very primitive, early stuff, but it's absolutely amazing. At that point, it was motion for the sake of motion. You could film anything. One of their very first movies was a guy getting a shoe shine. And that was enough. That was, wow, look at that.
Yeah.
The guy getting a shoe shine.
Did Vitagraph go on to specialize in a certain kind of film, or did they go for across the board?
They went across the board. They understood before a lot of other filmmakers that once motion for the sake of motion kind of had its day,
right,
that the thing that held people's attention were stories. And they tried to tell as wide a range of stories as they could. As vaudeville entertainers, Blackton had written some advertising copy about their act that said entertainment specifically designed to please all audiences. And they had that idea, carried that over into their filmmaking activities. So they made every genre, they invented genres, they made every kind of movie you could imagine.
Yeah.
You know, and a lot of them were very successful. One of the neat things about these guys, because they were both born in 1875, they came of age as young men at the turn of the 20th century. Because they had the immigrant experience, they wanted the American dream. They wanted to not only financially have better lives, but not to have the kind of other burdens that their parents had.
Right.
And they were dynamic go-getters, tireless workers, and they really had their finger on the pulse of America and on the dreams of a lot of people that didn't make it to America, but kind of pined away. Look at what's possible in America that's not possible here.
Yeah.
Their films just captured the imagination of everyone around the world.
Right. And what was it about the partnership of Blackton and Smith that gelled? Did one person cover certain areas and the other person covered certain areas?
Yeah. Smith liked dynamic, action-oriented movies. So, you know, one of the early successes was a jailbreak. And not only, and it was recreating a real jailbreak that had been in the headlines. It was a big, you know, a couple guys escaped from Sing Sing. So they're going to make their version of that. And Smith got more dynamic, putting a camera in a car to do a tracking shot as the guys are running away from the prison and stuff. It's a more dynamic shot. It's more cinematic, aesthetically pleasing and stuff. And those are the kinds of films that Smith gravitated towards for the rest of Vitagraph for the next 30 years.
Yeah.
Blackton liked making comedies, kind of over-the-top comedies, but he also was a social climber. And he didn't like where he was from. He wanted to move into better circles. So Blackton had the idea, well, let's do Shakespeare. So Vitagraph ended up making, I think, 12 Shakespeare adaptations on film. And if you can imagine Shakespeare condensed into 12 minutes with no dialogue, it's as bad as it sounds. But it was brilliant because there were enough people out there like Blackton that wanted to better themselves.
Yeah.
So I haven't seen these movies, but if they're making Shakespeare, I'm going to give it a try. So he's drawing in people like him.
Yeah.
He's also an artist. And he says, how do I used to make these lightning sketches in vaudeville. How do I make this cinematic? And he single-handedly invented motion picture animation. Wouldn't have happened without him.
Yeah.
Period.
And what is the average length of a film at that time?
Well, it depends when we're talking. You know, in the very beginning, movies were 30 to 60 seconds long, you know, in the 1890s. And, you know, by the time you're getting to 1906, they're about a reel long, maybe 12 to 15 minutes long. By the time you get to 1909, they're 2 reels long. 1911, they start to do 3 reel films. The guys that owned the Nickelodeons, where films were shown at that point, were saying no one's ever going to sit through a 2 reel film, let alone a 3 reel film. You have to stop this right now.
Right.
And it was all a lie.
Yeah.
And they kept pushing the envelope. And, you know, to their credit, they proved, Colonel Selig proved that, you know, people would sit through a 2-hour-long movie.
Yeah.
If you make a good 2-hour-long movie. And the Nickelodeon guys, it put them out of business. They had to get into the movie theater business and get into this whole idea of the long feature. So Vitagraph is going from their earliest films of 30 seconds to their later films are, you know, an hour and a half to 2 hours long.
Yeah. And you bring up theater ownership. This is back in the day before the antitrust episodes that went on, so a film studio could own theaters and run their own.
Well, they could. They could, and yet Vitagraph only on 2 occasions leased a theater. They leased a theater down on 14th Street and at the northern end of Greenwich Village for a summer. And then they leased the first Broadway theater in Times Square to show their feature films in.
Wow.
And they had that lease for 2 years. But the guys that had been showing Vitagraph movies for years said, if you go into the exhibition end of the business, you're going to put us all out of business. You can't do this. We've been faithful. We've been loyal to you. Please don't do this. So they said, okay, guys, we won't go there. We'll produce films. We'll distribute the films, but you guys can take over the exhibition.
Right.
And the guys that followed Vitagraph took over, the 3 components of the business are production, distribution, and exhibition. And that's a true monopoly. And that's what, Adolf Zucker and Carl Laemmle and the Warner Brothers and those guys. And finally, the Supreme Court caught up with them eventually.
Yeah. Were there actors, actresses, filmmakers, executives that went on from Vitagraph that we may have heard of?
There are, most of them towards the end that you might have heard of that had careers in talkies. One being Frank Morgan, who played the Wizard of Oz. He got his start in Vitagraph movies.
Wow.
Adolphe Menjou got his start in Vitagraph movies. In his autobiography, Mo Howard talks about the very first movies he was ever in were Vitagraph films. He used to hang around. He was just fascinated, like every other kid in Brooklyn. Like, you either go to the ballpark and you peek through the knot hole in the fence to see the ball game, or you're watching the movies being made in Flatbush. So,
do you think that the studios that we've all heard of, Fox, Warner Brothers, Universal, et cetera, Paramount, were they around at that time, or did they learn from Vitagraph and become?
They learned. Vitagraph was top of the heap in America and eventually around the world, biggest company. So, these were ambitious people. They all wanted to be the next Vitagraph. So initially, guys like Carl Laemmle at Universal or Adolf Zucker took Vitagraph personnel. Here, I'll pay you twice what you're getting at Vitagraph. Make movies for me. And that wasn't just talent. It was, the people in the developing room. It was the people behind the camera, the editors, just trying to take as many of their people as they could. And oftentimes ended up just hiring them for very brief periods till they could get up to speed. Okay, we don't need you guys anymore. And some of them would come back to Vitagraph and others would just keep moving on.
Yeah. It's always mentioned that one of the USA's greatest exports is films to this day.
Yeah.
How did Vitagraph make that jump from distributing material in the US to the rest of the world?
These guys were so smart because there was one guy that was distributing everyone's films outside of the Northeast for America. And he was based in Chicago. And there's a conflict of interest. If you're distributing Vitagraph movies and Selig movies and Lubin movies, and it's a conflict of interest. And you're not going to push every film that everybody makes. And Vitagraph learned in 1906, we need to take control of our own films for ourselves to distribute that. So they opened up a Chicago distribution office. Within 2 months, okay, we got to do this for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
They had found out that a guy that was representing them in England had been telling them, I wasn't able to sell your movie. And someone told them, the guy sold 800 copies of your movie. Are you kidding me? So both of them being from England, they set up a London sales office, distribution office. And then 2 weeks later, set up a Paris distribution office with the guy who introduced Smith and Blackton to each other. And Smith's brother ran the London office.
Wow.
So and they were the first American companies to do that for years.
Yeah.
So in their movies, it wasn't just that they created that business model. Their movies were preferred by everyone. So you get it out there and you find out there is an audience for this stuff, and it just exploded all over the world. So it's mind-blowing to look through the old papers, to read about where, in 1912, show us more John Bunny movies. Maurice Costello, who was their big matinee idol, who's the great grandfather of Drew Barrymore. He was the first great matinee idol of the movie. They sent him on an around the world expedition with cameraman and directors and actors and actresses. And they spent the better part of a year circling the globe, filming all over the place. And in some places, this was the first time people saw movies. In other places, in Rome, Maurice Costello couldn't walk down the street. He was mobbed like crazy. Everyone knew who the guy was. They couldn't believe it. Wow. John Bunny goes to England, same thing. And that hadn't happened before. It's the beginning of the movies. Who knew that there was such a thing as movie celebrity? Yeah, any extent. Right. And just madness. Yeah. So crazy.
I'd like to ask one more question, and then we'll go back to Anne Marie and Aurora. I know they have a lot of material. The history now, which you write beautifully about Vitagraph, Vitagraph seems to be lost in the history of film now. How did that happen? Why don't we hear more about Vitagraph?
For a couple of reasons. I mean, the biggest, Adolf Zucker became king of the hill after Vitagraph. And he insisted that the first movie history books being written start with Adolf Zucker. Wow. And he would say, you don't even have to look at the early stuff. It was made by guys that didn't know what they were doing. It's not even worth paying attention to. It all started with me. And they all took him at his word. And he was big and powerful and mean. And if you didn't do what Adolf Zucker wanted you to do, bad things might happen, literally. So that was that. And so movie historians have been repeating so many things. I mean, I can trace it back. I do a little bit in the book to the specific book, to the specific author, early film histories. Right. This is where this started. This is where this started. And it's, a bunch of nonsense.
Yeah. Andy, you've done a great job. We're going to switch it back to Anne Marie and Aurora right now.
Robert, thank you.
Thank you.
That was great. I really enjoyed that.
So interesting.
I actually, if you don't mind, Emery, I wanted to start because Bob kind of took the question I had.
I'm sorry.
No, but it's a really, really great one.
I'll just hold up the book.
Yes. Smith and Blackton, it was, you mentioned pretty much everything, the business model, their product, their innovations, everything was top of the line and first in their time, and yet we don't know who Blackton and Smith are. So I was just going to say that's pretty fascinating, and too bad for them.
Yeah, it is, and it's too bad for film history, because I really believe in my heart their innovations and their curiosity and their business model. If we paid more attention to them today, we might actually get more people going to the movies these days. I think things are so narrowly focused now, target audiences and things like that. Yes. And these guys thought, there's room for everybody in the movies, and let's, it makes sense. We want to make money. We want people to enjoy the experience here. Let's try to represent everybody. Let's, in different films in different ways. So it's a really great idea. So it's a nicer, gentler way of making movies, I think.
Right.
It's really interesting. Everybody thinks Hollywood, Hollywood, Hollywood. And classic movie fans also know Chicago played a little bit of role in movies. And as Aurora and I know Fort Lee. But to hear that Manhattan and Brooklyn played a role is fun. It's, I'm East Coast based, and I never knew about Vitagraph until very recently, being a classic film fan. And it's so interesting to just feel like, wow, right here on the East Coast, in Brooklyn,
long before Fort Lee.
Yes.
Fort Lee was an afterthought made by guys trying to imitate Brooklyn, trying to imitate Vitagraph. I mentioned this, Mr. Crane and I were talking a while back about this idea that the first Vitagraph studio was actually on a roof on Nassau Street in Lower Manhattan. So that the Beatles, it reminds me of the Beatles, doing their last concert that's in the Let It Be film. That Vitagraph is entertaining. Like, people would stop working or schedule their lunch hour so they could look out the window and watch these movies being made.
Yeah.
And so in my twisted brain, it's juxtaposed with the Let It Be concert on the roof. So
yeah, you're right.
It's really funny to, I think back what it must have been like at that time to see one of these first kind of, magic lanterns, and then kinetoscope.
Kinetoscope, yeah.
Yeah, my gosh, that must have seemed so unbelievably crazy.
Yeah.
I could imagine how these young men, they were quite young, got it into they had to do it. But I will tell you, the one thing that I was really found interesting in the book was all the trouble they had from Edison. I probably would have given up. I mean, there was like 5 or 6 years where they couldn't do a blessed thing, right?
Yeah, it was more like 10 years.
10 years. Oh my gosh.
And it was horrific. And Edison, there were other filmmakers that lasted a year.
Yeah.
Or lasted a couple of films and just couldn't hack it because of the persecution from Edison. And he was hitting everybody. He was an equal opportunity because he wanted all their money. He wanted to control everything. He wanted the credit for everything. So be it.
Equally fascinating too, the fact that they stuck to it is how different they were, really. Right? I mean, they started as entertainers, and of course they meshed perfectly with the business and things like that. But one was a very conservative religious man, and the other one was not.
Right.
So their values were very different too. So it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Their story is really fascinating.
It's the love of that common show business thing that put them together in the first place. We're poor immigrants. We don't have anybody. We have nothing. But if we can figure out to do something together, and then to grow into that business, and they had so much fun doing it. And then you get older, you're growing apart. The business is just humongous. It's a worldwide thing, and they're taking more on their shoulders than any of the studio executives that followed them. They had to train everybody that worked for them. You wanted to operate a camera? Here's how you operate a camera. You want to build a second camera? This is how you build. These guys had to teach this is how you act. This is how you make scenery. This is everything. And once they had that up and running by about 1908 or so, they could focus a little bit more on kind of bigger issues or whatever. But that came to be called the studio system. And people attribute that to Thomas Ince or to Irving Thalberg. And it's nonsense. But
the other thing I was thinking about, since Smith was the magician, correct?
Yeah.
And that, I guess, dabbling in animation. Did he do something with stop was it stop motion?
Stop motion.
It's just astounding when you think about it, what they were doing, right?
There's a movie they made in, they would make an annual Christmas movie. And I think it was 1906. The Little Joe's something or other. Name escapes me right now. In this movie, this street kid who's living on the street, he's an orphan, is taken in by a family. He's having this dream that he's taken in by a family on Christmas Eve, and he's made one of the family, and he gets to sleep in a bed in the bedroom with the other kids. And there's this moment as he's falling asleep, the camera pans from this little boy to the toys that he's just received on his nightstand, and these little toys start to come to life.
Wow.
And then
Kind of like Toy Story.
right, within the same shot, it pans back to him when the toys finish their little performance, and it pans back to that little boy asleep. That's the first example in a story film of stop motion. And it blows my mind that the first feature film made in computer animation is Toy Story, uses the same idea. And I know those guys weren't aware of Little Joe's Dream, whatever that's called.
And about what, 100 years later?
100
right?
years later.
Wow.
And yet it's the same idea, this
idea.
huge leap in cinematic technology and visual effects and stuff.
I think it's so
Why?
astounding. I think people take for granted that cinema today, this is where all of the groundbreaking is, but it's not true. I mean, a lot of these old, films are just astounding what they had done with with nothing.
Yeah.
It was really astounding.
Literally starting from scratch on everything,
And
every
imagine
aspect
a
you can
world
imagine.
that never existed before.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's astounding.
What's it going to be? What do we make of this?
So I know you mentioned for a second that I think it was Smith who did like a tracking shot. Were there other things that they did that people still use today? I mean, I'm sure.
Well,
but how else?
like I said about Blackton movie animation, the whole
The animation.
The whole idea starts with him, the whole execution and everything, and he kept refining it, and then other people took it from there.
So animation, the way they shot, innovations in the way they shot.
Cameras too. They would build cameras better than anyone else.
You've probably heard this if you're an old movie fan. You've heard the term the flickers as one of the terms for old movies. Well, it was because there was this flicker that would give people headaches in the old days.
Right.
That's right.
Albert Smith figured out how to get rid of the flicker. And he patented this. And movies stopped flickering because of this little device that Albert Smith came up with. And it's, until, traditional projection ended and we got into digital projection, every subsequent movie that you go to see, you don't get a headache thanks to Albert Smith coming up with that.
That's just amazing.
Yeah, and it's sad not only that they didn't get the credit, but that they knew they didn't get the credit.
Yeah. And both of those guys died thinking there weren't any more Vitagraph movies. They were all gone. They were all destroyed. They were all missing. They thought it's over. There's nothing left. There's no legacy or anything.
It's heartbreaking.
And that had to be tough.
Yeah.
So are there films anywhere? I know a lot of them are lost forever, but can any of us fans find any of them anywhere?
Let me put my cheaters on here. There are a few sites online. It's called the iFilm Museum, the National Film Museum of the Netherlands, has a whole bunch of Vitagraph films that they've put online. So if you go to iFilm Museum, and I would suggest read the book, this thing.
It's a wonderful book.
In tribute to Mr. Crane's old compañero, John Candy, for you wearing 3D glasses. A little bit of that. But if you read the book and you see a film that looks like it might be interesting,
Mhm.
Google that title, because I would say about half of the films that I'm writing specifically about, you can probably find online. A lot of them are still in archives spread out all over the world. One indication of how big Vitagraph was internationally is that the British Film Institute has by far the biggest collection of Vitagraph films in the
Oh, wow.
world.
That's great to know.
And, you know, the Netherlands Museum has the third largest. Library of Congress has the second biggest
Okay.
batch of Vitagraph movies. But the iFilm Museum, there's also something called the National Film Preservation Foundation. They've preserved about 5 or 6 amazing, great, awesome Vitagraph movies that if you love movies, I don't care if you never saw a silent movie, if you like movies, see the ones that have been preserved on that site. And there are others. You can YouTube, the quality of the prints on YouTube vary. And it might put you off if you see a bad quality print. So I would say if there are alternate prints to look at, try to look at the best print you can.
You know what, when we post this video up on the Classic Movie Hub site, I'll add some of those links there because I think that people really should check them out. I mean, it's so
absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. I'll be honest with you, Andrew. I actually, when I was reading your book, I got a brand new notebook and started taking notes. I found it interesting. And I didn't want to forget anything. I'm like, oh my gosh, Edison did this. Oh, I got to write that down.
Thank you.
So
thank you.
I found it interesting. We do have one question from someone who's in the chat. Let's see if I can write. Okay. As a researcher, how big of a grain of salt do you take when you use memoirs written for a popular audience like Two Reels and a Crank? Do you look for corroboration from another primary source?
Absolutely. Two Reels and a Crank was Albert Smith's autobiography. And there's some really neat stuff in there, but he made the same mistake that everyone that's ever been in the movie business that wrote a memoir makes. He lies through his teeth, forgive me, Smith family, about certain things that just didn't happen. The worst I ever ran across was Tom Mix. And the things that Albert Smith did that are true are mind-blowing. He didn't have to fib about this or that to make himself look better. I think he was doing some of this in reaction to years had passed. Everyone else was getting credit for stuff. So he was overcompensating, I think. And Blackton was trying to get his autobiography published, and he wrote 2 different manuscripts and couldn't even get those sold. And he did the same thing in his autobiography. So I try to keep in mind Mosaic law. If you can find 2 or 3 witnesses that are in agreement with each other, then you're pretty safe. If it's just one person saying, I did this, I did that, I don't know. But you got to go to the primary sources, because too many historians just look at an old history book and say, oh, well, that history book's from 1930. That must be true. And it isn't, trust me. Or, you know, don't ever go to a Wikipedia site and go, okay, I've learned about that now. Oh, no. So, you know, we all want to be well informed, and
indeed.
You know.
Yeah, I liked, you know, learning about some of the, I think Florence, I want to say Florence Turner.
Florence Turner, the Vitagraph girl.
Vitagraph girl. And
amazing.
Different from, I want to say Florence Lawrence was the biograph girl.
Florence
was the Vitagraph girl.
That's right. So, and confusing people ever since.
So Biograph and Vitagraph around the same time, Biograph kind of, Vitagraph sustained, yes?
Yes, yeah. And Biograph, really the only reason we pay attention to Biograph is because of D.W. Griffith, his years at Biograph. And his first star that he hired when he got the gig was Florence Lawrence, who had been a Vitagraph performer.
And who no one knew her name though, right? She was just
they didn't know her name. Florence Turner was the Vitagraph girl. Florence Lawrence, was kind of the blonde, and Florence Turner was the brunette, but Florence Turner got more roles. And D.W. Griffith said to his assistant, go hire Florence Turner pay her whatever she wants to come over.
Oh, no.
And this guy goes and he's like, he used to work at Vitagraph too. And he was in love with Florence Lawrence. So he goes to Florence Lawrence and says, Mr. Griffith wants me to get Florence Turner, but I want you. Don't you want to make more money? Come with me. And he brings Florence Lawrence back and says, I couldn't find Florence Turner, but here's Florence Lawrence. You
Oh,
like
no.
her too, don't you? Yes, I saw you. And he mentions a Vitagraph film. And he said, I thought you were great in that. Hires her on the spot. She gets married to the guy that brought her over. There's soap operas all over the place.
my
Yeah,
gosh.
yeah.
I wish we could live like forever, like hundreds of years, so I could would have seen all of that. And
Yes.
that must have been astounding. We have a
Yeah.
couple more questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I mean, I know we're almost hitting on an hour, but so I have a question here. Interesting. Why are Vitagraph and Vitaphone similar in their names? That's interesting.
It is because in 1925, Warner Brothers made Vitagraph an offer they couldn't refuse. They said, we'll buy the company. We want to be like you guys. And Albert Smith said, you can't just buy a piece of the company. It's not going to work that way. If you buy us, you have to buy everything. Okay, what's it going to take? It turned out to be a little over $800,000 in 1925 money. Now, in 1925, most Americans were not earning more than $750 a year. So you can't even put
Right.
$800,000 in context anymore. But the first thing when they bought the company, they were developing that sound technology. And they wanted to use the Vitagraph studios in Brooklyn to make talkie pictures. And they wanted to kind of piggyback on the Vitagraph reputation. So they created this new entity called Vitaphone, which really shifted movies for a while from life pictures, Vitagraph, to life sounds, which was the
Right.
emphasis of the early talkies. There wasn't a lot going on. It was just talking for the sake of talking. And that's how that kind of confusion has arisen. They did keep the Vitagraph name for a handful of movies. Frank Capra's movie, Meet John Doe, is produced at Warner Brothers, a Vitagraph production. And that was 1940, I think.
I never noticed that.
Yeah, next time you see in the
Another
opening
reason
credits.
for me to watch the movie again.
Yeah, it's a great movie anyway. And
Yeah.
then the last Warner Brothers cartoons that were made in the 60s, half of them in the end credits says a Vitagraph release. So for the cartoons, it kind of came full circle from J. Stewart Blackton inventing this stuff to Warner Brothers cartoons going out as a Vitagraph release back in the 60s.
Looks like we have one more question.
Okay.
All right. How long did it take you to write the book?
Boy, that's a good question. I think I started writing the book in earnest in 2016. I did a tour of American archives and then went over to Europe and looked at hundreds of movies, and then came back in the fall and started writing. And I finished right when the pandemic was hitting. And I was going back and forth on whether to include a little bit of information about the Spanish influenza epidemic of 1918. And then it was like one of the last things, okay, that's going back in. I've got to fit that in there somehow. And how it affected Vitagraph and the business in general. So, and then it took another year to do the editorial stuff with University Press of Kentucky. And they've been great.
Well, I just lied. I said that was the last question, but someone just asked another question. So
sure.
this is the last question, I promise.
Yes.
Okay.
And then we'll let you enjoy your Sunday evening. Not that you're not enjoying this. So this person, Rob, says, I have to ask, after immersing yourself in so many Vitagraph films, did you come to appreciate the slapstick antics of Larry? Is it
Larry Seaman.
Yes.
Oh, Larry Seaman, yeah.
I'm not familiar. Oh my.
Larry
Okay.
Seaman was, for a couple of years, his movies made more money than Chaplin, Keaton, Harold
Oh
Lloyd.
my gosh.
That's
Wow.
how big Larry Seaman was. And this guy started as a newspaper cartoonist, and he would draw. His drawings for newspapers were people in motion, objects in motion, animals in motion, and he is just nonstop motion. He does a train ride in a movie called The Show from around 1921 or thereabouts. The first half of the movie isn't very good. When they get to the big chase that involves a locomotive in the second half of the movie, it's 10 minutes of the most breathtaking stunt work with cars and trains and planes and everything else. Take your breath away. So there's one more thing about Larry Seaman. He had a co-star in 3 movies by the name of Stan Laurel.
Oh my gosh.
His co-star from about 1921 to the end of 23 was a fellow named Oliver Hardy,
Oh
who
my
he was
gosh.
most associated with. They made like 25 or
Fascinating.
30 movies together right before Laurel and Hardy got together. So Larry Seaman films are still shown on TV in Germany, in Italy, in South America, and he's publicized along with Laurel and Hardy. People know this guy the way that we know Chaplin. People in
He's
other
included.
countries to this day.
He's included in the new-ish a Blu-ray set of early Stan Laurel and Oliver
Yeah.
Hardy movies.
Yeah,
You'll see him in there. And I watched the whole thing. It's fantastic. And he was fantastic.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so that's something new for me. This is fabulous. I'm learning so much, and this is
Yeah.
so interesting. I could probably talk to you guys for another 5 hours. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you. This is what Mr. Crane and I do. We
It's a blast being part of your show, Anne Marie and Aurora.
it is indeed.
so
Yes,
much.
thank you so much. I mean, it's fascinating. I
both
love
are
just
great.
listening to all
Thank
of the history and everything, you both know, and talking to you. Yes, there's a,
Thank you. And for those of you that didn't wear your 3D glasses, shame on you.
All right, okay, the trifecta. Here we go.
There we go.
So,
Right.
I can't thank you enough. I really can't.
Thank you, Anne Marie.
Bob,
Thanks,
Andrew,
Aurora.
this is great.
Really appreciate
Thank you.
your time. This
Thank
was
you.
such fun for me.
Thank you.
Have a great night, and I hope we do this again. I say that all
Yeah.
the time.
Yes.
Well, University Press of Kentucky, you're doing a great job. They're putting out
Yes,
great
indeed.
books. So
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Thank goodness, right?
yeah,
Awesome.
definitely.
So, and
Thank you
thanks
so much.
everybody for watching. Thank you all. Thank University Press of Kentucky. Aurora, thank you. And have a great night, everybody. And hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye,
Thanks a lot.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.